So please join me in welcoming Diane Eickhoff.
Thank you very much for inviting us to this event today. This is my husband, Aaron Barnhart. He was for 15 years a TV critic at the Kansas City Star. And what year did you leave?
2012.
2012 left so that we could organize and put forward our own books and books of others on the topic of history, mostly social justice history, and suitable for readers really 12 and up. And so we work hand in glove on all of that business. And Aaron has taken a larger and larger role in the programs that I present due to my declining vision. But he knows this program as much as I do, and we'll do our best to give you a good story to take home.
Thank you, Diane. So what we usually begin with is by putting a slide up on the screen that shows 6 famous Civil War battles, and I'll read these off to you. Wilson's Creek, Vicksburg, Gettysburg. As you know, both of those happened on the same day, or culminated on the same day, July 4th, 1863. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas, Antietam, and the Battle of the Wilderness, which happened during the final year of the war between Grant and Lee. So 6 very diverse battles, and they all have one thing in common, which is that female soldiers are documented to have fought in each of those battles, and in many of those battles they fought on both sides. So before we get to the drama of female soldiers, though, it's important to understand the context in which it happened, the story behind the story. And the story is that going into the Civil War, it's a time of incredible change in American society, including for women.
And the reason you had to have change and why these women organized for the very first time in history was that most of these women had been working already in the anti-slavery movement. And by being involved in that and doing the work that was involved in it, they realized that women lacked some of the same basic rights as citizens of the country. That, of course, it wasn't slavery, but it was definitely their civil rights were curtailed. And I usually put up a slide, don't we, that has a list of kind of the most important civil rights that women lacked. Everybody knows about the franchise. Everybody knows about the right to vote. But there are other things almost equally important. And those were married women could not own property in their own name. They couldn't bequeath it to whom they chose to. Women did not have equal custody rights in cases of divorce. If the husband wanted the children, he got them. Women could not attend any public university. They could not serve on juries. They were banned from all of the important and well-paying trades. And if they were widows, I always think this is particularly interesting. If the husband died without a will, the wife was entitled to 1/3 of his estate. The other 2/3 had to be given to the husband's relatives, male relatives, even if they had to track down a 5th cousin in England. So for all of these reasons, and then of course women couldn't vote, and if you can't vote, you don't have much say in changing society. So they were coming from a unique position of trying to win their civil rights from men who were the ones who had to vote them into being. In 1848, the first women's meeting was held in a little church in Seneca Falls, New York. They had called a meeting. There were 4 or 5 women who had sat around a table together, And they were talking about, you know, we really need to do something. Let's call a meeting and see if we can air the grievances that women have in society. And they expected maybe a dozen or 2 dozen women to show up, and turned out they had over 300 people with the 2-week notice came to this meeting. And they discussed all the grievances that women had, including the right to vote. That was the first time this had ever been publicly stated. And there were, it's good to remember that there were also men at this meeting as well as women. At that time in history, I would say there were as many men who supported women as there were women who were opposed to changes for women. So we had our male cohorts on our side. In fact, the well-known ex-slave abolitionist Frederick Douglass claimed that he was a woman's rights man, which is a pretty brave thing to say at that time in history. Well, there was so much interest in it that the fires quickly spread to other places other than upstate New York, and a meeting was called. The first National Women's Rights meeting was held in 1850 in Worcester, Massachusetts. And again, they didn't expect a huge crowd, but they got 2,000 to 3,000 people at this first convention. So this movement is taking off, right? We're 11 years before the Civil War, but this movement was taking hold across the northern section of the United States.
Yeah. But the Civil War does, in fact, intercede, and the women are asked, much as the women are asked if you were watching the PBS series on World War I, they were asked then as well to curtail their suffrage activity. And this is 50 years later, they're still carrying on with suffrage activity. They're asked to curtail their suffrage activity for the duration of the war.
Right. They are told that after the war, after this little war is over, they will pay attention to women's rights. They will be given the franchise. This is what the women leaders in this movement, including Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and our own Clarina Nichols, who came to this part of the country.
Yeah. So another part of walking into the story of the female soldiers of the Civil War is to confront our own stereotypes about what a woman looked like and acted like in the Civil War. And for most of us in this room, that was shaped by literature that we read as children or as adults about the Civil War. And there are 2 books, and probably everybody in this room has read one or both of those books that have shaped our public image now, our memory of what it was like to be a woman in the Civil War. What were those 2 books? Gone with the Wind. And Little Women.
Excellent, excellent.
It's a
and that
sharp crowd here.
Yeah. No, that's sometimes people don't get the second one so quickly. But the Little Women were in the north, and of course Scarlet was in the south. And this was the picture that we had. I think none of us grew up with an idea that women played much of a part in the Civil War beyond keeping the home fires burning, which was very important, of course. But in more recent years, people have found that women were actually integral to that war. They were as involved as were their menfolk, even when they were not on the firing line. And we're going to quickly go through some of the things just to give you a sense of the kinds of roles that women played in the Civil War before they thought, well, maybe at the same time that some women were thinking about going to battle and becoming real soldiers.
And because a picture does say 1,000 words, I am going to walk around with the laptop because if you think of your image of Scarlett O'Hara or of
Jo March.
Jo March.
Don't we love Jo March?
Yeah, even with her tomboyish image, these girls knew how to dress up, and certainly the cover that we have of Little Women shows them all in their finery, standing around the piano singing. So we associate a certain appearance as well. And the reality is that women in who needed to make money in the Civil War, for instance, would often enlist with the Army not as soldiers but as laundresses. And what I'm walking around with here is an image of a woman who does not look glamorous in the least. She's been following or accompanying the Union Army and doing their laundry.
She gets paid $15 a month perhaps for it, and as you look at this picture, you'll see she's pictured with 3 children, a dog, and a man. The man is maybe her husband, maybe her brother, we don't know. The children are definitely hers, I'm sure. Why would a woman do such a thing? Why would she go off to do laundry in the Civil War?
So we mentioned the money. How much would she make compared to, say, a soldier's wage?
Oh, quite a bit less. I'm not sure. I'm not sure the exact ratio, but she definitely had very small means. But in addition to the little bit of money that she earned in doing laundry, she would also have had room and board, so to speak. And the Civil War people, the armies in the Civil War were very different than the kind of fighting that's done today. I mean, the armies were actually almost villages with all kinds of people in the village. Sometimes wives were there, whole families were there, prostitutes were there, little hospitals were there. They had to have field hospitals after they'd been in battle to take care of the soldiers. They had to have huge amounts of food brought in and tents and whatever else they needed. So it was actually a very active place with a certain number of women employed doing various things. Besides laundresses, they were also worked as cooks. And we have a picture of one. I don't think you can walk around with all of these, but
this particular one, and I'll just go back and forth and isolate. But it's a picture of a Union Army regiment, and these gentlemen look like officers just from the apparel and the fact that they have their own tent, and so they're posing for a picture. But you'll notice that their cook has worked her way into the picture here. And she's black. In fact, she's probably what came to be known in military parlance of the time as contraband. She very likely was an enslaved woman when the war broke out, and the Union Army came to her part of the South, and she ran toward the Union lines. And within a few months of this happening, it was happening on such a scale that the field generals were forced to make decisions about how would we treat them. And they decided that since the South considered them to be property, so would the North. And in a clever little semantical, but also what turned out to be a very devastating policy decision, these generals decided that they were going to seize this property as contraband and then immediately liberate it. And then they were welcome to follow the army around and make some money as a cook or oftentimes as a laundress, sometimes even as nurses, and they would be paid for their compensated, sometimes for the first time in their lives. So another back on the home front, women would also perform another number of functions. And again, this led to a transformation of the roles of women both during the war and after the war. One example is that just the fact that there was no procurement of things like bandages, uniforms, the things that we would normally expect now a large company to supply the U.S. military was actually supplied by the women of the North and
yeah,
South.
the women turned their homes into miniature factories and produced the goods for the army. There were also contests in all the towns for knitting. How many socks can you knit? And there were prizes. One woman had knitted 1,000 pair of stockings. But these are vital things. The Army cannot do without food and clothing and help of this sort.
So that's one part of the transformation. Here's another part. Before he became a famous poet, Walt Whitman actually served the Civil War as a nurse. And that was not unusual because before the Civil War, all nurses were male. It was a man's profession, nursing was. That all gets flipped by the Civil War. Women began serving by the thousands as nurses and by extension as hospital infirmary chaplain.
Dorothea Dix was head of the nursing, the Army Nursing Corps, and she has a very strict standards for this was bringing women into a mainly masculine setting, and she wanted to be sure she had the right kind of women there. So her requirements for a nurse included being of good character, over the age of 30, and homely of face. She didn't want any hanky-panky going on. I'm sure there was probably a little of that.
How many of you have watched the PBS series Mercy Street? So this is a fantastically well done, really quite accurate fictional representation of a Civil War hospital in Baltimore, I believe. Yes. And the very opening scene shows a woman, and she is in fact Dorothea Dix, interviewing a pretty young thing to join her Army Nurse Corps, and she gives her a very historically accurate cold shoulder. That makes it clear that this woman, with her fetching beauty, is not what she has in mind for her model nurse. Now, also out of the Civil War, we get the service of Clara Barton.
Ah, yes, Clara Barton. Anyone know who Clara Barton was after the war? Red Cross, yeah. She was head of it. She organized the Red Cross, or founded the Red Cross.
Yeah, and the only county in Kansas named for a woman is Barton County. Yeah.
So there we go.
Another woman who would make her impact on Kansas after the war is Mary Ann Mother Bickerdike.
And she was a widow from Illinois, but she served in some many field hospitals across the country with Generals Grant and
Sherman.
Sherman as
What
well.
did Sherman say about her? Like she was ordering somebody around on the battlefield.
And he said, by what authority do you do this?
Yeah.
And she said, by the authority of God Almighty. Can you top that?
Well, they tried to. They took that to General Sherman, and Sherman said, she outranks me.
She, after the war, came to western Kansas, and helped some 300 veterans of the Civil War, northern veterans of the Civil War, get claims to land in western Kansas. So she's much beloved by people who remember her.
So on the one hand, you have this great need for medical and supplies, bandages, clothing, particularly as the war, which again everyone expects at the beginning will be a short war, becomes an all-consuming war. On the other hand, you have this great shortage of men going off to war, leading to women entering the nursing profession. When you combine these two, you get a wholly new system that had not existed before the war and will have a transformative effect on American medicine after the war, and that's known as the Sanitary Commission. Sanitary commissions were started in both the North and the South. We mostly associate them with the U.S. Sanitary Commission. But there were also smaller sanitary commissions, and these were responsible for marshaling relief supplies and efficiently delivering them. They also held highly successful fundraisers known as sanitary fairs, raising millions of dollars, again, to go to the effort of providing for the provisions of the sick, the wounded, and the men who are still out on the battlefield. It's worth noting that the Missouri Sanitary Commission, that was the most successful, that the women who were involved in the leadership of that during the Civil War out of St. Louis would, after the Civil War, found the first radical suffrage organization in the state of Missouri. There's all of that going on.
Yeah, and the Sanitary Commission was all the officers in charge of the finances and so forth were, of course, men.
Yeah.
Almost all the workers, I would say, were women. So the men were all fighting, but the women really were the people who ran that organization.
There was a need for education and freedmen schools. How many people are familiar with freedmen schools? Well, do we know what a freedman is? One of these folks who has probably self-liberated, or in some cases been liberated by the arrival of the Union Army. And they grow in great numbers, and so there's a need to educate them.
Right.
And that leads to the creation of freedmen's schools, because many of the people in the North who were radical abolitionists, and it should be borne in mind that they always are a minority of Northerners, very small but vocal and politically influential minority. And they're thinking ahead to when slavery is dead and gone. And they realize that for the Negro, it's still going to be an uphill climb to full citizenship.
Because, of course, educating a Negro,
they're illiterate.
Teaching him or her to read or write was a crime in the South, punishable by fine or imprisonment, or both.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that leads to freedmen's schools. Now, the shortage of men is leading to other problems as well, which is that who's going to build up the war machine? Who's going to make all of the rifles and ordnance that need to be delivered out onto the battlefield, where the battles are much larger and bloodier than anybody ever imagined? So women wind up taking factory jobs on a large scale for the first, but certainly not the last time. One of the books that we have out there is actually one that we published called Gunpowder Girls. We asked a woman who had written about the Civil War before. She'd actually written another book that we published to give us an original book about what women did in the Civil War, and she came back to us a few months later and said, I have to tell this story because nobody's told it before. Throughout the North and South there were arsenals, and the jobs of the arsenals were to build new rifles and bullets that went in them. And the men would build the rifles, and they quickly began assigning the women to roll the ammunition, and they were the gunpowder girls. So they would take the bullets, they would roll them in a paper cartridge, and then roll it in a larger pack, and they would do this by the millions, because there was an insatiable demand for ammunition out on the battlefield. These women and girls, some that she documented as young as 9 years old, eventually began working 72-hour weeks. That's how big the demand was. And the conditions, let me just tell you, were not safe. Gunpowder Girls is about the 3 worst arsenal disasters of the Civil War. Casualties were as young as 10 years old, and Tanya did a really terrific job of telling that story really for the first time ever, and we invite you to look at that afterward. But again, they're working in factories, male supervisors, of course.
Yeah, and the same thing is happening in Washington, D.C., where all the clerks and secretaries who had all been male, of course, went off to the war. There's an unending need for more men for the war machine, North and South. And in both instances, women filled those roles. They worked for the first time with really good wages. But what percentage of what men earn for the same job do you think that they got? Guess. Oh, that's too pessimistic. It was half. They got half of what men earned for doing exactly the same work. And after the war ended, what happened? They were all laid off. But it was a time when you got to see what we're really talking about here is that society got to see that women could do many things. They were involved in all kinds of things that have been kind of forgotten through the years. But they were a very vital part of the economy, both in their homes and in the work that they did for either the North or the South.
So now we switch from the home front to the battlefront. And the first role we're going to talk about that women perform in the battlefront are not as unconventional as the subject of this talk. A number of women use their womanly ways to obtain information about the enemy. These were the spies and scouts of the Civil War.
And this is not necessarily a job that women hadn't done. Women like Mata Hari have been famous through history for their plunging into spy networks and so forth. So this is kind of an extension of that. And there were female spies and scouts on both sides. Mm-hmm. In the North, there was
you had
Harriet Tubman, and she was famous for what organization, if you want to call it an organization, the Underground Railroad. She was from Maryland, and she helped some 300 enslaved people reach freedom. She never lost a passenger, she said. Mm-hmm. And so after the war, during the war, she became a spy for the Union Army. And being a spy meant using all of the skills that she had acquired over the years. And it also made she was also a safe kind of spy. Why would that be? Why would she be so effective? How would people think about her? If they saw an older black woman, would they suspect her of being a spy? Probably not. So she didn't even have to go in any kind of disguise. She was who she was, and she was very effective because she knew Maryland like the back of her hand. So she delivered much needed intel to the Union Army.
That's right. And she was actually even effective. Knowing backcountry made her effective in other places like South Carolina and Florida, where at one point, not only did she report back accurately the location of rebel pickets, but she took part in the attack on them, and so she too was a female soldier during the Civil War. Pauline Cushman is an actress.
She was an actress in the North, so her acting abilities served her in good stead. She was for the Union, and she went south and was in fact captured by the Confederacy and sentenced to be hanged. The day that she was to be hanged, the Union Army came in and rescued her. So there's a happy ending to that
story. Which she told over and over again, because by 1865 she's out on the theater circuit. She's out on the speaking circuit. She's giving her talk, and she wrote a quickie memoir that got a lot of attention. And yeah, she by the end of the war, she's profiting off of her. She's capitalized on this.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Now, we're going to talk about three women who served the cause of the South. The first is Rose ONeill.
Rose ONeill was a socialite in Washington, D.C. She was a widow, a wealthy widow. Her husband had passed away some time before that. He was a lawyer, and when he died, she sued San Francisco, where they were living at the time, for I don't know, grievances of some sort against the government, and she got $10,000, which was a lot of money at that time in history. She came back, and she was very active in the social scene, at first with both Union and Confederacy, but as time went on, it was obvious she was really she was the leader of a spy ring in Washington, D.C. She was imprisoned twice. And even when her house was when she was on home arrest and when she was in jail, the secrets kept getting passed around. So somehow she had a network that helped her succeed.
Do you think this had something to do with the fact that her 12-year-old daughter Rosie was allowed to stay with her while she was jailed in the old?
That's kind of an interesting little detail. Is that I never thought of that. Rosie probably was a carrier, right, for her mother.
You know, and so something needs to be borne in mind here, and this is important when we get to the female soldiers discussion, which is that savvy women combatants whether they're fighting as spies and scouts or as actual soldiers, are very savvy about using men's traditional-minded views of women against them.
Right.
So they will take full advantage of the unfair or the double standard that applies to women.
Oh, I would never know anything about war, right?
And even if they suspected it, it would be so dishonorable and impolite. We have cases. There was we have at least a couple of cases. Only a woman in Warrensburg who was pro-Confederate shot and killed a northern soldier who was rude and impertinent to her, and his commanding officer later came and apologized to her. And we have a very similar example involving Belle Boyd.
Belle Boyd was a young woman when the war started. She was from Virginia. She was 17, I believe, at the time. And she was a very patriotic Southerner. And as the army was, the Union Army was marching through town, she hung out a Confederate flag. And when the Union Army saw it, of course, they wanted to cover it up with the Union flag. And she and her mother were just ready to spit nails. And when the Union officer came to their door and demanded that they take down the flag, she shot him. And then she also was excused because they said she was protecting her mother. And you can't punish somebody for that. But she got very skillful in carrying messages back and forth between the Confederate generals. And even at one point, she went to England to try to gain support for the Confederacy in England. That did not work out. She came home, and she actually had a Union soldier that she was sweet on. And she married him, and there was a lot of commotion about that one.
Yeah.
But
in fact, both this pro-Southern women tried to went abroad to enlist England in the cause, because until relatively late in the war, it was thought that Great Britain's heavy dependence upon Southern cotton would ultimately sway them to aid the Confederacy, sell them submarines and steel reinforced ships and anything else that they needed to at least force a stalemate in the war. So both of these women were enlisted, and in the case of Rose ONeill, did not have as happy an outcome as it did for Belle Boyd.
No, actually, on the ship on the way home from England, her ship sank, and she died. And it was said that she actually died because there were gold pieces sewn into her dress. We'll never know that.
Yeah, yeah.
That was the
Because they
story.
needed money as well.
There was a story. Let's move on.
So, and we're going to move on with the last example, and this is the one that's closest to home and sort of, for me, represents kind of the leaping off point from where women are performing, again, as conventional, as women in their traditional roles doing something untraditional, to being a full-fledged combatant, someone who's implicated and could very well be imprisoned for what they did. And that's a case close to home, a woman named Eliza Gabbard, whom we found out about through the founding director of the Bushwhacker Museum in Nevada, Missouri. If you haven't been to the Bushwhacker Museum, I think it's open this time of year, and it's in the ground floor of the Nevada, Missouri Public Library. And the term bushwhacker refers to a pro-Southern guerrilla fighter who was largely the only force out there to cause trouble to pro-Union troops throughout the state of Missouri after military control was won over by the Boys in Blue. The Confederate Army needed their regular troops further out east. So the guerrillas really kind of filled the vacuum, and they did it quite effectively. It's thought that probably no more than 4,000 guerrilla fighters up and down the Missouri-Kansas border required 50,000 Union troops just to keep chaos at bay. They were very good at ambushing Union and Kansas militia officers, very good at launching raids. William Quantrill would even sometimes call on Confederate brigades to come up and assist him, and they'd attack with no attempt to sort of keep that territory. They would just attack, cause a lot of mayhem, and then withdraw. And as the Union Army struggled to deal with this problem, one of the things that they eventually identified as part of the problem were the women. Patrick Brophy, the founding director of the Bushwhacker Museum, gave them a name of Lady Bushwhacker. And Eliza Gabbard is probably the one that we have the most information about, which is to say, not much. But we know that she came from a very pro-Southern family where most of the men were bushwhackers and spent most of the year far from their homes, usually hiding out where they couldn't be seen and organizing activities. Eliza Gabbard, her role was to make sure that these men had food and forage and intel, and if they needed to be bailed out, she would go and appear at the Union jail and maybe flutter her eyes and tell the soldiers that these men had nothing to do with the rebel cause whatsoever, and they would be let go because what could you do? This woman was on her honor, and you as an honorable soldier needed to take her at her word. Eliza Gabbard was very effective at that, and so she and others operated rather freely for most of the Civil War until new Union leadership came in and started rounding them up. The feeling was, if we can't figure out where they're doing their work, we're just going to lock them up, and then they won't be able to communicate with their menfolk. We don't know how they're doing it, but we're going to get them off the streets. And so they began rounding them up and putting them in garrisons and jails. And that was how they contained the threat of the Lady Bushwhackers.
Yeah. So they were really soldiers without uniforms.
Yeah.
And fighting for their cause in the way that they knew it, but close to home.
So now we've walked into the main event here,
okay.
which is the fact that that some 400 to 1,000 women have been documented as female soldiers in the Civil War. So what does that mean?
And that means that they actually, cut their hair, put on men's clothing, used guns, and passed themselves off as men in order to join the cause. This was possible because at that time in history, there wasn't a big physical examination. They were probably more interested in whether or not you had strong teeth so you could tear open your bullets than in whether you were male or female. There were no exams to that matter. So women who were interested in this or who were determined to serve in the Civil War took on this very unusual guise. They had to disguise themselves, and they bound their breasts and wore men's clothing, cut their hair, and tried their best to look like male soldiers. And this number, which we will never be able to verify completely because we'll never know about a lot of them who are probably successful. But there are a number of questions that need to be asked about them, in terms of who they were.
Okay. So there were no physical exams or whatnot, but wouldn't they be found out at some point if they're because they're in very close quarters with men, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how did they get away with it? Or did they?
Well, yes, they did. Yeah. They. There were also no barracks at that time, so People were living in pup tents or small tents of one sort or another. So they didn't have this sort of contact with a large number of men. They could go off into the woods and do their business. There were not bathrooms to go to. There were not open showers. If you really felt the need to shower after 6 months or so, you just jump in the river and not necessarily taking off all your clothes. And they would have to really be careful. Some of them may have had someone standing by them. It's maybe a husband or a brother or a lover that could have helped them keep this secret.
So how do we know about them if they were so secret?
Well, we know about them because of reports that came after the Civil War. Several of them wrote books about this, their experience. But at the time, newspapers loved the story. If they found out that there was a woman who had been serving as a man, you better believe this was big news, and this was exploited to the fullest to sell newspapers. So there are articles about this. There are also letters home from men who served in the war who were very surprised. But we haven't mentioned who these women were, where they came from, and I think we should mention that.
Yeah. So they're a little different from the women who are staffing the sanitary commissions and working in the Treasury Department.
Yeah, they're tougher, and probably most of them grew up on farms. So they knew how to handle a gun, or they knew how to, do a lot of things that women today or even men today don't do. So they had skills that would be useful. They came from their motives for becoming soldiers varied. You can think of some of them. Shout out what you think. Why would a woman do this? I mean, this is dangerous. You could get killed. Well, one thing is they felt they were patriotic. They believed in the cause. You had to be somewhat adventurous to do something like this. So they were adventurous. The women that today or yesterday at least would have been called tomboys. They came from families perhaps that really needed their income. I would say that a big part of it was financial. For the very first time, these women were earning exactly what men were earning. This was absolutely, you can imagine, astounding.
They couldn't be discriminated against because nobody knew.
Yeah, if they were found out, they would have been dismissed, right?
Right.
And if they became pregnant, as some did.
Okay, so we've covered a couple motivations.
Yeah.
Financial.
Financial.
Yeah. Anybody think of any other reasons why, if you were a woman especially in rural America, why you might want to pretend to be a man and fight in the Civil War? Protect your land. That's right. Very strong sense of country, both in North and South.
Be near someone in your family.
That could be too. You might have.
Yeah, like a husband.
Yeah.
Well, see, now that's a tricky thing because, again, I think from the literature that you've gone through, a lot of these women remained, and one of the cases we'll explore in depth in just a minute, they were a mystery. Their true identity was a mystery to everybody around them. How did they deal with really personal matters?
Oh, you're all waiting for this, right? How did they deal with periods? Well, in the first place, probably a lot of them stopped menstruating. As we know from elite athletes, they sometimes stop menstruation. So that undoubtedly played a role. But at that time also, women could dispose of these bloody rags in a camp that was full of blood, right? This would not be too difficult to do. And they did. And they did, as far as we know. I don't think anybody has actually written about this, but we've surmised that that's what they must have done. Either their period stopped or they were able to conceal it and to hide the bloody rags with the rest of the things. So there were a few who did in fact become pregnant. We know that.
Yeah. Do we, from the ones that we have the documentation, do we know if they were injured at any rate similar to?
It was
male
similar.
soldiers? How do they compare?
Yeah, they compare well. They about the same number of women that we know who are involved got promotions and were injured or got ill. There were lots of ways to get to die in the Civil War. Most of them having to do with diseases like cholera and malaria, which just went through whole camps, decimated whole camps of people, and women were among those who died in those ways.
So you've told me that this is a pretty recent school of Civil War scholarship. You'd think that every story about the Civil War had been dug up and told in the first 50 years. But no, this is a relatively new discovery, is the sheer number of women serving in the Civil War. Why is it?
Why is it? Why we're
Yeah, why is it? Why are we just getting these stories now? Is it because men did not? Because all the scholarship beforehand was done by men? Was it?
I think that's part of the reason, sure. But it's just that the more the Civil War is discovered, there's an endless number of ways that you can look at the Civil War and study it, and so I think as we've had more female historians, that it has become a more interesting subject. But even at that time, shortly after the war, the women who were fighting for women's rights loved these women. I mean, Susan B. Anthony and the others in the movement really were inspired by this, and they felt that this showed that women could do any job that men could do, and we've taken a lot longer to really agree with that. But that was thought shortly after the war. They used these women who were not feminists. They were not outspoken in rights for women. They were more from the working class, and the women who ran the movement, women who were really invested in the movement, tended to be the more educated women in the community. But
you were going to say?
I was going to mention the Antietam.
So ways that they were found out. We've talked about a couple of them, but sometimes they were found out purely by. Well, could we call the Antietam story an accident? Well, tell the Antietam story.
Well, Antietam was the bloodiest single day in the Civil War. Thousands and thousands of casualties on both sides. And after that terrible battle was over and there was a lull in the fighting, a man wrote home to his mother and he said to her, "Dear mother, you'll never believe what happened. This morning, the sergeant had a baby." This is true. This is a true story. This is astounding to me how but don't we all know women who've been able to conceal a pregnancy? Really right up to the end, it happens. And this was this is the proof that it happened.
Yeah.
They didn't really do anything when they found out they were women.
They were dismissed immediately. Yeah, they were dismissed. And if they happened to be captured by the Confederates, what do you think the first thing would be? Did you say
Set
what?
them free. Interesting.
Set them free. That's interesting. It's close to that actually. They didn't. They don't talk about rape.
Yeah.
They were actually given women's clothing to put on. Give them a skirt. Goodness, get these women out of the pants, and give them a dress or give them a skirt, and get them out of this situation. Yeah. They would not have approved of this in any way, shape, or form.
So let's explore a few of these stories of female soldiers up close. We'll start with one person who was buried at Vicksburg Cemetery, where the Battle of Vicksburg was fought. And this person's story is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that this person's true identity was only discovered at death. And the second reason it's significant is we'll never actually know her identity. Alfred J. Luther enlisted on May 30th, 1861 in Company A of the 1st Kansas Infantry. So he enlisted out of Elwood, Kansas. If you're familiar, I think that's right across from near Atchison. Unbeknownst to those in the regiment, Alfred Luther was actually a woman whose real name is lost to history. She had risen to the rank of corporal before the Battle of Wilson's Creek. There she was slightly wounded, her identity not discovered, and then she was promoted to first sergeant in 1862. They were attached to General James McPherson's 17th Army Corps, but Sergeant Luther never had the opportunity to participate in the campaign on Vicksburg because she died of smallpox in Louisiana 3 months earlier, on March 22nd, 1863, and was buried on the site of the doctor who treated her there at Lake Providence. Her remains were later removed and interred at Vicksburg National Cemetery, and we are grateful to the Park Service for their research on this. Now, one of the things that the Park Service discovered in their investigation into Sergeant Luther's death was a letter written by a Lieutenant Frederick Haywood to his sister. Lieutenant Haywood was part of the 1st Minnesota Artillery, not to be confused with the 1st Minnesota Infantry that was fighting at Gettysburg. These guys were at Vicksburg. And he wrote his sister, after Sergeant Luther's death, the following. Well, you can imagine their astonishment. The regiment's camped near us, and I went to the hospital and saw her. She was deceased by this time. She was of pretty good size for a woman, with rather masculine features. She must have been very shrewd to have kept her secret so long when she was surrounded by several hundred men. The 1st Kansas was one of the first regiments that entered the service 2 years ago. This girl enlisted after they went to Missouri, so they knew nothing of her early history. She doubtless served under an assumed name. Poor girl! Who knows what trouble, grief, or persecution drove her to embrace all the hardships of a soldier's life? She had always sustained an excellent reputation in the regiment. She was as brave as a lion in battle and never flinched from the severest fatigues or the hardship duties. She had been in more than a dozen battles and skirmishes. She was a sergeant when she died. The men in the company all speak of her in terms of respect or affection. And here's the clincher. She would have been promoted to lieutenant in a few days if she had lived.
That's kind of an amazing first-person account, isn't it? That really touches your heart when you hear that. You just still does every time I hear you read that.
Yeah. So let's. So an example you'll read about if you probe into the literature, you won't get very far. There are books in the Johnson County Library system you can check out. And one of the first stories you'll come across is that of Frances Clayton, also known as Frances Clayton, and I don't remember which is the male and which is the female.
Well, she was she did a smart thing by just changing one vowel in her name so she could remain Frances. I think that was good. And she enlisted with her husband in a Minnesota regiment, and they said that she had a lot of mannerisms. She had picked up the mannerisms or chosen them or was having fun with them or maybe revealing her true self. But she was apparently, she smoked cigars and she drank and she did all manner of things, hit on women. You know, she was a character, I guess, but apparently also very brave. She fought in Minnesota, in Missouri and Tennessee, and Stones River. At Stones River, her husband was killed, and it was said that she stepped over his dead body and kept firing. She developed either malaria or some other condition whereby she was found out and dismissed. And the last we know of her, she was walking or riding toward Washington, trying to get some back pay for her deceased husband and for herself. Whether she got that or not, we'll never know.
Now the photo here on the next one is a little blurry, but it gives you pretty good, I think it still gives you a pretty good sense of why this person probably had no trouble enlisting in the Army. This was Jenny Hodgers, but pretty much from the Civil War onward, she was known as Albert Cashier.
And she was an immigrant from Ireland. She was what we would probably call a trans individual today. As far as we know, she dressed in male attire and passed herself off as male her entire life. She also served with they said she was very quiet, kept to herself. She was with a regiment from Illinois. And her after story is pretty interesting. She went to work as a janitor, and was again, from all accounts, really kept to herself throughout. And as she got older, she had some World War wounds. And she was hospitalized at the Veterans Hospital. And even though those people at the Veterans Hospital, I'm sure, knew who she really was underneath all it all, nobody revealed it until she had emotional problems or mental health issues, I guess we would say today. In that time, they would have said it more bluntly. And she was brought to an asylum, and because she was a woman, they of course took her male attire away from her, and she was forced into a skirt, which she had never worn in her life. She tripped on her skirt, broke her hip, and died from the hip injury after surviving 3 years of combat in the Civil War. Her regiment honored her. She's buried among them with both names, and they spoke very highly of her. So she had a sad kind of ending, but she deserves to be remembered for serving with valor.
Now the next person I'm going to walk around with, you'll notice this is not a photograph of her. This is a woodcut, and it comes from the book that she published after the war, a very scandalous account of her adventures on and off the battlefield as both Harry Buford and Loretta Anita Vasquez. And yes, that is an incredibly phony-looking fake mustache and beard in the soldier picture.
I think what happened with that photo is that after the war, she was using her notoriety to make a living, and so she had pictures taken of her dressed in a uniform and then put on that fake mustache, which I agree, you'd feel like pulling it off.
I think it's something
she's born from a wealthy family in Cuba. She immigrated to the United States, lived in New Orleans, where she met her husband as a teenager. Some of her family over there was trying to make other arrangements, but she fell in love with an American. And they had 3 small children. The first one, or the little boy, died shortly after being born, and the 2 little girls both died of yellow fever in a couple years later. So she's lost all 3 of her children. The Civil War has begun. Her husband has gone off to train. She goes with him, and her husband is killed in a training exercise. So here's this poor woman has had all of these terrible losses. She just falls in with a regiment of soldiers. She does not even go to a recruiting office. She falls in with them, and she's apparently very good at whatever she's faking. And She is involved in many wars, including Shiloh, which was a terrible battle. After the war, she writes an expose, which becomes a sensational thing, and she's criticizing the Confederacy. Basically, she's saying you should have done this and you should have done that.
Which Jubal Early does not take kindly to.
No, he doesn't. He's not happy about this woman, so he really smears her reputation. And for many years, she was not very well known or respected. It was like, take this with a big grain of salt. But in more recent years, feminist historians have discovered through checking with newspapers and to see what was going on that she really was, or could have been at least, involved in all the things that she said she was involved in. So she became also quite, she wrote a book, My Life as a Soldier or something like that, which some libraries actually still have. Do have.
Yeah, it was reissued a few years ago. However, the book you're most likely to find in the library about a Civil War soldier, because several of them have been published, including for children, is the story of Sarah Emma Edmonds.
Ah, yes. She was a Canadian, and she was the fifth daughter of a Canadian farmer. He was not happy having a fifth child be a girl. He wanted boys. So she learned to do all the boy things, but in hopes that her father would accept her and value her, which he did not. In fact, he decided to marry her. He was abusive toward her, she says, and he was about to marry her off to a 60-year-old farmer in the neighborhood. She ran away from home. She ran across the border, came to Michigan, put on male attire and sold Bibles door to door. And when the war started, she enlisted with the Michigan Regiment, and she also served for 3 years. She's the one we know the most about because she also wrote a memoir, and she donated all the money from the memoir to the veterans, Union veterans. So she was not a sensationalist like a couple of the others were. So she has a very fine story. After the war, she came to Missouri and then to Fort Scott, Kansas, and raised her family there. She said the neighbors never could understand her and her motives in that, but she seems to have been a very honorable person, and she was also buried with her regiment. She is in fact one, or maybe there may be one other person, but she received a pension from the U.S. government for injuries sustained in the war.
Yeah.
$12 a month.
$12 a month, and a lot of women, the women after the war did not get their due. Obviously, the fact they were still fighting for suffrage 50 years later should tell you that. Although a number of these other reforms that women were calling for were addressed in that time frame, just not suffrage.
Yeah, and our Clarina Nichols is one of them who helped bring major changes to Kansas ahead of women in other states.
That's right. That's right. She takes part in the 1859 Constitutional Convention in Wyandotte City.
And she gets things written into the Kansas Constitution that existed in no other state.
Yeah.
So she's an amazing woman.
In other ways, though, progress would be very slow in coming. Harriet Tubman, even though she is invaluable to the Union Army, does not get a pension until 1899. And of course, true liberation for African America lasts until the 1876 election, when Reconstruction is brought to a halt as part of the backroom bargain that made Rutherford B. Hayes the president.
Nevertheless, I hope that this little program has helped you understand the many, many different ways in which women contributed to the war effort on both sides, but I'm particularly happy that the North, of course, did succeed in winning this war, this terrible, terrible war that continues to fascinate us and whose details are still being revealed.